Howdy, it's Beefy. Playing with dynamics in Cinema 4D is fun, but it can also be frustrating at times. There's a high level of patience that's needed when setting up dynamics, and if you don't know all the settings and what they do, it can be a bit daunting. In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how I animated my letter B for the 36 Days of Type challenge back in 2021. I was asked if I can make a tutorial on how to make it, so here it is. If you want to watch my entries for the 36 Days of Type challenge back in 2021, I'll include a link in the description below. What I'm going to show you today is pretty basic, and it's a good tutorial for newcomers and for anyone who wants to learn more about dynamics in Cinema 4D. There's a few tutorials out there that show something similar. There are many ways to achieve similar looks, but I want to show you how I approach creating something like this. And just with a few simple elements added to the process, you can get something that looks really dynamic and interesting. This process I'm going to show you today is slightly different to how I created the original letter B animation. Since creating the original, I've honed the technique, changing a few things to get a better animation. Just by using text objects, a cloner, rigid body tag and an inheritance effector, you can create something that's really interesting and looks great. It may be a simple setup, but you can create some really complex looking animations. So before we crack on, I'd like to take the time to welcome new viewers to the channel. This is a place where I post tutorials, tips and other stuff. I'm just sharing the knowledge that I picked up along the way. Hopefully it will help you in your future projects. We're all constantly learning, and it's great that we can do this together. So why not subscribe today and tinkle that notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. You have nothing to lose. And a big shout out for everyone who subscribed and liked my videos. You guys are awesome. So let's crack on. Okay, so I just jumped into Cinema 4D. I'm using Cinema 4D R25. You can use any version of Cinema 4D to follow along. I'm just going to go through my project settings. So I have frames per second, which is 30, and my max time on my timeline is 300. So it gives us a little bit of a wiggle room. Our animation isn't going to be that long, but we can just move. It's going to be easy to move keyframes around, etc. So I'm just going to start adding some things into my scene. So I'm going to be creating the lowercase b to uppercase B animation that I created for the 36 Days of Type back in 2021. And I'm going to add a text object, and I'm going to make some changes here. So I'm going to use a font that I like, which is Arial Black. You don't have to use this font. You might not have this in your list. So I'm just going to use this because it's a nice big rounded chunky font there, but you can use any font that you want. But if you're going to have a lot of clones in your simulation, then I suggest that you use a nice big text. And I'm going to align that to the middle, and I'm just going to change this to a lowercase b. That's kind of our start point, and I'm going to put 40 centimeters in the depth there, so we have enough room for our clones to fill the volume here. And I'm going to call this lowercase b. I'm just going to use a lowercase b. I'm going to give my fat fingers a rest today, and I'm just going to copy this out, and I'm just going to call this uppercase B, and I'm just going to change the text spline to an uppercase B there. So there we go. There we got our two elements that we're going to be morphing between, and I'm just going to put these into a null, and I'm going to call this text. And I'm just going to drop these in here. So it's going to be easy for us to hide these later on. And I'm going to set up a camera. And this camera, I'm going to come to the coordinates. I'm going to zero out the H, zero out the P, and zero out the X. And just going to come into the camera here. And I'm just going to get this all into position. So I'm going to maybe do 70 on the Y, and I'm just going to come right in here. So I'm almost filling the screen, but we've still got some space around it to see the particles flying around. You can adjust this to whatever you want there. So I'm just going to right click, come to rigging tags, and I'm just going to pop a protection tag so we can't move this camera now. And we can just come out whenever we want into the perspective view there. So I'm just going to hide the camera. So I'm going to hold down Alt and double click the traffic lights. So now we don't see that when we're going to perspective view there. Okay, so far so good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn off the capital B, the uppercase B here. And we're just going to be working on the lowercase b for the moment. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a cloner object. So I'm going to drop a cloner into our scene here. And I'm just going to change the name of this to cloner. Cloner setup. So the reason why I call this cloner setup is because we're going to be creating the simulation first, and we're going to be using the cube for that. And the reason why I'm using the cube is because it has fewer polygons than the text objects that I want to clone into the simulation. So when we add the rigid body tag, we're going to get a faster and more accurate simulation. Originally, when I created this animation, I used the text objects, and I had a lot of ironing out to do because they were different shapes and sizes and they had more polygons. So this way is going to be a lot easier for us. So once we set up a simulation, then we're going to be creating another cloner, and then we're going to be using an inheritance effector to get the new clones to adopt the PSR of our cubes. Okay, so let's bring in a cube object. So I'm just going to bring in a cube. It's a primitive. I'm just going to change the size, it's too big. So if I select all of these parameters here, the X, Y, and Z, I'll come into one of the fields, type 5, Control Enter, and then that's going to change our cube to 5 centimeters cubed. And now I'm going to drop that into my cloner here. And by default, we got grid on. So I want to change this to object. And we're looking for an object here. So I'm just going to take my lowercase b text object and I'm going to drop that into my object field. And we only have one clone to our object here. And we don't get the attributes here that we need, like the distribution and the clone count, etc. And the reason why I think this is probably, I could be probably wrong about this, but the actual text object is actually a text spline with an extrude. It's not an actual object. And we need to tell the cloner that this is an actual object. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a connect object. So if I select both of my text objects here, I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to bring in a connect object. And that's going to apply one to each of my text objects there. So I'm just going to change these names to lowercase b to uppercase B. Okay. And now I'm just going to hide the uppercase B one here for the moment. And if I come back into the cloner, I'm just going to take the connect object for the lowercase b and I'm going to drop that into the object field instead. So now we have the attributes that we need. So we can now change the distribution, the count, and also the seed, etc. So now I'm going to hide the text here. I'm just going to hide them all. And they come back into the cloner here. So I want to make sure that I have distribution as volume. And now I'm going to increase the count to say something like 1000. And if I come out the camera, we can see that these clones are now filling the volume of our letter there. And because I'm using 1000 clones, I'm just going to put the render instance on. So this is going to work faster in our viewport here. So I'm going to be morphing between the lowercase b and the uppercase b. And I'm going to set some keyframes now. So I'm going to make sure my playhead is at frame 0. And I'm just going to set a keyframe here for the object. So this is the lowercase b. I want the lowercase b to be on the screen for 3 seconds. So I'm just going to come down to 90 frames. And now I'm going to drop the uppercase b into the field here. And I'm going to set a keyframe. So now we have this wonderful looking animation here. I guess you can hear the thrill in my voice here. So what we're going to be doing is morphing between the lowercase b and the uppercase b. So if I just come down to frame 89, I'm going to reduce the polygons for the moment. So I'm going to reduce this down to say 10. I'm going to explain something quickly here, how this animation is going to work. So if I come to the transform tab, I can just change the index here. And I'm just going to move right in here. So the index, each clone has an index number, and we're in the distribution of volume, and our volume mode is going to be random. So these are all randomized. So we have 0 here, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, etc. So these are all placed by the clone. So the clone is saying that I want 0 over here, 1 over here, 6, 7, etc. So when we change the text object, so when we go to frame 90, when we change to the uppercase B, everything changes. So 0 is now up there, 1 has jumped over to there, and this is a different randomized pattern here because it's a different object. But these clones are the same, these index numbers are the same. So within the cloner, so when we're in lowercase b, this is the randomized pattern, and then when we're in uppercase b, this is now the new randomized pattern. So these clones are going to travel between each position. It's instantaneous at the moment because we're just going from one to the other, but when we add the rigid body tag, we're going to see the actual path of these clones, and this is going to make this look really, really dynamic. So let's add a rigid body tag and see how this works. I'm just going to increase the count back up to 1000, and I'm going to turn the index off in the display. So I'm just going to put none. There we go. And I'm going to come back into my camera here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to right click the cloner here, and I'm going to come down to simulation tags, and I'm going to add a rigid body tag. So now we've got our tag that's applied to our cloner here. I'm just going to come to the beginning, and I'm just going to press play. Everything falls down because we have gravity in our scene. So I want to switch that off. So I'm just going to open up my project settings. And in my project settings, I'm just going to come to the dynamics tab. So I'm just going to turn off the gravity. And if I play this now, everything flies away. So what we need to do now is we need to tell the clones that they need to travel from their initial state to their new location. So we're going to be actually telling the clone that it needs to follow a path that's been designated for it. Okay, and it's a path that we didn't see because we were jumping between the two different letters here. It was kind of instantaneous. So now we've added a rigid body tag, these clones now have to travel along a path to get from one position to the next position. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to come into the rigid body tag, and I'm just going to go through a couple of these settings here. If we come to the collision tab, just make sure you have apply a tag to children and individual elements as all. And I'm just going to keep my shape as automatic. So this is going to be a fast, quick calculation. And also down here, we have the bounce, friction and collision noise. We may be changing the friction here. We'll see how we go as we're creating this simulation. But generally, everything that we need to play around with is in the force tab. And so the first field here is follow position. So this is going to tell the clones that they need to follow the path that's being set out for them. So we're going from one letter to the next letter. These clones need to get to the new position when we swap to the uppercase B there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to increase this number. So at the moment it's saying do not follow any position. So if I just increase this by 1 and play, the clones are going to stay relatively where they spawned, but now they're going to try and get to their new position. And they're all kind of grouping together, trying to get past each other. Some have reached where they've got to go, but these ones here are still finding it a bit difficult. In the follow position here, the higher the number, the more accurate and more quickly the clone will get to their new position. So I'm just going to pop that up to 5. And we're going to see a little bit of a difference here. So that's working a lot better now, and we're kind of forming the B, but I want to get this done in 3 seconds, so I'll need to make a few changes. And the things that are going to affect this simulation is how many clones you have, how big the clones are, how high the number is for follow position, and also friction. So we may need to reduce the friction here, so that might be problematic for our simulation. So if we still get a lot of bunching up here in the center, we're going to be changing the friction to help that out. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to reduce the size of the clone. So I'm going to be adding a random effector to our clone. So with the clone is selected here, I'm just going to add a random effector. And now that's changed everything in the X, Y, and Z. I don't want to affect the position, I just want to affect the scale at the moment. So I'm just going to click the scale, and I'm going to say I want uniform, and I want this -0.7, and also I want to make this absolute scale. So we have these nice random looking clones here now. So now when I play, these are going to get to where they're going to go very, very quickly. So for the moment, I'm just going to come into the rigid body tag. I'm just going to reduce that to 4. Because although I want these to follow the path, I don't want them to follow the path accurately. I want them to kind of overshoot and bounce around a little bit. So I'm just going to play this now. And that's looking good there. So now we've got this spin going on with our clones here, and this is where the follow rotation comes in. So what I want to do is I want to set up some rotation for these clones. I want an initial rotation. So I'm going to open this up. Let's select all the fields, and I'm going to say 360 degrees in each field. So now these are going to be randomly rotated there. So in the rigid body tag, the follow rotation is that this is going to be the initial rotation on the clones, and then when they go to the next object, which is the uppercase B, they're going to have a new random rotation. So now we have the option of actually saying that we want these to follow the rotation. So I'm just going to up that up by 1, and you're going to see that these will calm down a little bit when they land on the uppercase B there. So a lot of them calm down now, so we've still got some major spin going on there. So I'm just going to up this to say 3. And a lot of them are spinning a lot faster, but they slow down really quickly. And I think that's a really good number for the follow rotation there. So okay, the other thing that you may want to do is you may have some intersections with your clones here. So if we come to the project settings, and in the dynamics tab, if we come to expert, we can just set the collision margin. So I'm going to set that up to 2. I find that's a good number. If there are any intersections, we're not going to see a lot because these clones are going to be moving around. And the other thing you may want to do is increase the steps per frame. So at the moment the steps per frame is set to 5, and this means that in between frames there's 5 calculations. If you want a little bit more accuracy in your simulations, then you need to increase this, and this is going to be more accurate for you. So if you increase this to say like 25, there's going to be 25 calculations in between each frame. But the higher you put this number, the slower this is going to get in your viewport here. So just be warned about that. So if you're going to increase your steps per frame, that would be the last thing you do before you cache your simulation. But generally I find that 5 is good enough, because I want this to be a little bit chaotic. I don't want this to be too accurate. I want this to run really, really quickly. So these numbers here, I don't want to put these up too high. I'm going to keep them as 4 and 3 for the moment. I may increase or may decrease later on in this tutorial. We're going to see how this goes. But if you're experiencing like clones that are really, really getting erratic and stuff, you can increase the linear and angular damping. So this is going to cut out some of the kinetic energy in our clones here. But I think this is okay for the moment. So that's looking good for me. We're going to be increasing our clones, so I'm just going to increase them now. I'm going to say 2000. And we're going to see how this plays. So that's not looking too bad. I'm just going to play that again, and I'm going to stop at one point, because I want to get these to get where they're going within 3 seconds. And that's not too bad for the B, but I just want to reduce the friction slightly in our rigid body tag here. So I'm just going to come down to the collision here. I'm just going to reduce the friction to say maybe 50%. And that's good, they're not bunching up in the center there. So that's looking pretty good there for me. Okay, so what I want to do now is, I don't want my lowercase b to be here at the start. I want this to drop in from up above. So I'm just going to be adding a couple more elements to our animation here. So I'm going to be making a copy of my lowercase b here. So I'm just going to hold Control and drag that out. And I'm just going to call this start. And this start here, I'm just going to make this visible for the moment. And I want to change this start to something that's going to be long and thin, and it's going to drop down. So I'm just going to change this to an uppercase I. That's looking good there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come into my cloner setup here, and I'll make sure that I'm on frame 0. And I'm going to open up my date sheet. And these are my keyframes I have for the moment. I'm just going to make sure I'm going to select these. I'm going to move these down 30 frames. And now I'm going to set a new keyframe with our start. So come into my cloner here. I'm going to drop my start into the object field, and I'm just going to set a keyframe. So I want these to fall from above. Let's just turn this off for the moment. And I'm just going to take the start connector here, and I'm just going to move this up above here. I'm going to make sure that this is around about 200 centimeters. That's a good number. So now when we play this, these fall down and they're going to form the lowercase b. You may notice that there's a few clones down here. We're going to be sorting that out later, so we don't need to worry about that. So when I come to the end of this simulation, I want them to leave the same way, to move up. So I'm just going to make a copy of my start here, and I'm going to call this end. And I'm going to leave it as the uppercase I, and I'm going to move this down here so that we can see the order of our animation here. And I'm just going to press H on the keyboard so I can get all my keyframes up. So we changed to the uppercase B at 120. I want the uppercase B to be on the screen for 3 seconds as well. So I'm just going to move my playhead down to frame 210. And I'm going to open up my cloner setup here, and I'm going to drop the end into the object field there and set a keyframe. So now these are going to leap up like that. So we kind of got everything nearly set up here. But I'm just going to make a preview now. So this is important for setting up simulations, is to keep making previews. I like to make previews before I actually cache. This is different in other versions of Cinema 4D. I'm just going to come up to the picture view drop down here, and I'm just going to make a preview. You find that next to your render settings button there. And this preview mode, I'm just going to keep on very, very low res, which is 960. And the frame rate is exactly what my project is. And I'm just going to keep everything as default. So this is going to create an MP4 for us, and it's going to play it in our viewport renderer. And I'm just going to click OK. We're going to be doing this a few times, so I'm going to speed through this so that you don't have to wait along with me. So now this is done here, so I'm just going to stretch this out here, and I'm just going to scroll in here so we've got this nice and big. So this is going to be really low res, but we're going to see the actual motion of our particles or our clones here. And that's looking good. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the follow position, and also at the end here, I'm just going to actually scroll down here. This here, I don't want these clones to just move up. I mean, there's maybe something that you want, but I kind of want them to bunch together first and then move up. So I'm just going to create another element for our timeline here. So I'm going to take the end text object, I'm going to hold control, and I'm going to drag this out, and I'm going to call this one bunch. Let's just do that for the text object as well. Just keep organized. And I'm just going to set the Y position back to 0. And let's just turn this on so we can see. I'm just going to turn that on and see where this is. So this is in this position here. So what's going to happen now is that these clones are going to be bunching into this before they start rising. Let's bring the playhead down to, say, 205 here. And if I come into the cloner setup here, I'm going to take the bunch here and drop that into the object field and set a keyframe. And now I'm going to hide it again. We don't need to see that. And these two frames, because I want the uppercase B to be on for 3 seconds, I'm just going to move these down So the first keyframe is on 210. And we're going to make another preview. And this is the most tedious part of setting up simulations, is to make previews, make some decisions, make some changes, make a preview, etc. Wash and repeat. It's a little bit tedious. But if you keep your simulation manageable, then your previews won't take long to render. So this is rendered now. And we're going to see what that looks like. That's looking good. I like that. So this bunches up quite nicely there and then moves up. And I've got a nice motion on my... I have a nice motion on my clones there. These are moving here. I'm just going to speed up the follow position. I said I was going to do that and I didn't do that. So I'm just going to bring this up to say 6. Going to make a preview. So this is done now. And let's see how this looks. Yeah, so we got a little bit more movement. And that's looking good there. Okay, so I can tweak this as much as I want, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to say that this is exactly what I want there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to cache everything, the whole simulation. So I'm going to come to the cache tab. I just want to keep the local coordinates, but you can also have include collision data. So I'm just going to leave collision data unchecked, and I'm just going to say bake all. So this is going to bake everything for us. And that was fairly quick there. So now I can just scrub down the timeline. I'm just going to hide the dope sheet here. So now I can just scrub down the timeline. And everything's being recorded. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a text object. So I'm just going to turn my cloner off for the moment. So we have our original cube there. So I'm just going to pop into the front view and just going to move right in here so we can see our cube. So this cube is going to be a bounding box. So I'm going to set my text to be within this bounding box here. So I'm going to create a text object. I'm going to bring that right down the bottom of our object manager there. And I'm just going to come into the text object and I'm going to change the font. So I'm going to use the same font that I created the simulation with. So I'm going to say Arial Black. And I want to say this is going to be 7.5 centimeters. That looks like a good size there. And I'm just going to make some changes to the alignment. So I'm going to say align in the middle. And also I'm just going to say this is going to be a capital B, uppercase B. And now I can just align this with my cube here. And the axis is at the bottom of our text object. I want this to be in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the text one and I'm going to say Alt G. That's going to create a null for us. And I'm just going to call this text. So now I'm just going to align the text object here. So I want to bring this down so it's just where the box is. That's looking good there. And I'm going to come to the top view and I need to align this in the middle of the box as well. So I'm just going to come to the text object. I'm going to decrease the depth to say 2.5. That's looking good. And I'm just going to get the text and just position it in the middle of the box there. So this, all the recorded data of this cube is going to be acting like a bounding box for our text. So when we use the Inheritance Effector, the text is going to adopt the position, scale and rotation of the cube. Because we recorded the data with a cube, we know that we're not going to get many intersections, so it's going to look good. So I'm going to turn the cloner setup back on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new cloner. I'm going to bring that down underneath my cloner setup. And I'm going to call this cloner Inheritance. Hopefully that's how you spell it. And I'm going to drop my text object into my cloner. So by default, again, we have grid array. I'm going to change this to linear. And the reason why I'm going to change this to linear is because we can actually say how many clones we're going to have in our cloner here. So I'm just going to keep this low for the moment. And now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make sure that I have my cloner inheritance selected, and I'm going to come into my effectors tab. So I'm going to bring in the Inheritance Effector. So what I'm going to do before I do anything is I'm going to create a null. I'm going to call this effectors. And I'm going to drop these effectors into the null there so we can keep everything nice and tidy. So we can hide this when we need to. So the cloner inheritance, it has the Inheritance Effector applied to it. So how this is going to work is if we come into the Inheritance Effector itself and come to the effector, we now can say that we want the clones in the clone inheritance to adopt the PSR of the clone setup here. So we need to reference the cloner setup. So I'm just going to drop this into the object here. So the cloner inheritance is going to look at everything in the cloner inheritance and also the cloner setup, and it's going to match up the index for each clone. The other thing we need to do is in the Inheritance Effector, we need to make sure that Morph Motion object is checked. And once I have this checked, the clones should have jumped to the position of the original clones there. So we can't see them because we have our original cloner showing there. So I'm just going to hide this. I'm going to hold Alt and double click the traffic lights there. So now you can see that these clones have adopted the PSR of the original clones. So I'm just going to come into the clone inheritance here, and I want to increase the amount of clones. So I'm just going to change the instance mode to render instance, and I'm just going to increase the clones to 2000, which is the same amount that we have in our original cloner, the cloner setup. And now we have our text objects in our cloner there. And that's looking good. So that's basically it. Let's make a preview, and we're just going to see, this is going to be low res again, but we're going to see how this is looking. So there we go. This is our preview, and that's looking good there. The one thing we need to do now is we need to sort out these clones at the initial state there. So if we just come down to the point where the lowercase b enters the scene, we can see that we have these clones just appear at the bottom here. We need to sort that out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get down to that point there. I think it's, yeah, just around about here. So we're going to hide these. So I'm going to turn off the, just hide the cloner inheritance here, and I'm going to turn on the cloner setup. And with the cloner setup selected, I'm going to come down to the Mograph menu here, and I'm going to select Mograph Selection. And if I just come out the camera here, we can scroll right in here so you can see what's happening. So with this tool selected, I'm just going to change the mode from brush to rectangle because I've got a group of these that I want to select here. And if I just make my selection, you can see as I make my selection, these little black dots appear on the clones there. And if I release, these are all highlighted. And now we have the selection tag applied to our cloner. So with these selected, I'm just going to bring in a Plain Effector. I'm going to drop that into my effectors there. And in the Plain Effector, I'm just going to come to the parameters. And I'm not going to be using the position, I'm just going to use visibility. And with that check, nothing happens yet because I need to add a field. So I'm going to come into the fields, add a linear field. And if I just come into my camera here, with the linear field selected, I'm just going to move this around. And you can see that this is going to hide these clones here at the bottom. So I don't need this to be like really big here. And I'm just going to move this over and I'm going to park that over here. So now when these clones come down, these are hidden. So I'm going to make one more preview. Before I do that, I'm just going to hide the cloner setup and unhide the cloner inheritance. I'm going to make a quick preview. This will be the last one, I promise. That's looking good there. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I think that's looking great. I'll probably want to add a few more clones here because we've got some gaps in the uppercase B. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I think that's looking great. And I think that's looking really smart. So what I want to do is just go over the things that are going to affect your simulation. And the first is the amount of clones in your scene. The more clones, the more complex the calculations are going to be. So initially you would want to use a manageable amount of clones. That amount will be determined by how fast your PC or Mac can work. So that figure will be different for everyone. By keeping your initial clone count low will help you set up your animation without having to make previews. And always use the render instance and the multi-instance so you get a faster playback in your viewport. The other factor is the size of your clones, and using the random effector you will get a nice array of different sizes and it will help your animation flow. And in your cloner, using objects with a low poly count will speed up your calculations and the simulation will be more accurate. In the rigid body tag, the follow position and rotation may be the only fields that you'll be concerned with. But if you do get bunching and have a high number of clones, then just adjust the friction amount in the collision tab here. And also, if your clones do have too much kinetic energy, you can use the linear and angular damping there. But generally I find that these figures 5% is good. But you have the option there just to calm down your kinetic energy. I'm just going to come to the project settings here. So in your dynamics tab here, just come to the general here. So we switch off the gravity, but you may want to add a little bit more dynamics to your simulation just by increasing some gravity there. You're going to get some different flow of your particles or your clones, etc. in your simulation. But generally for this one, I just wanted to keep the gravity switched off. So you can just apply some gravity if you need to, or if you want to experiment a little bit more with your motion of your particles there. So in the expert tab, if you do get a lot of intersections, you can just increase your collision margin there. And again, the steps per frame, if you want to have a more accurate simulation, then you can increase that. But only increase that when you're ready to cache your simulation. And the other thing you can do to get a nicer render, you can add a bevel to your text objects in the cloning inheritance. This will give you a nice edge or rim lighting to your clones, but this is going to increase your polygon count. So if you're using Octane or Redshift, you can use the round corner nodes to add some nice round edges to your render without increasing your polygon count. So when you add your bevel, if you do need to add a bevel, just keep the polygon count as low as possible. I'm going to leave the lighting and textures to your creative selves. I just wanted to go through how to set up this technique, and hopefully this will help you with your future dynamic simulations. This is a pretty basic introduction to dynamics, but it's a lot of fun and has a lot of potential for some really amazing animations. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Hopefully what I've shown you today will help you in your future projects. If you like what you've seen, then please give this video a big thumbs up. Like, subscribe and tinkle that notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. It will help the YouTube algorithm thingy help others find my content. Also, you can check out my latest experiments, concepts and dailies on Instagram at Almost Daily Render. And as always, any feedback and questions, please leave them in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you have any problems, I'll be glad to help. And while you're here, you can check out my other content. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.